Professor Adam Silverstein, you've written a book about a character who, for many Jews, is like the ultimate bad guy, but this bad guy may not be known to many Christians and Muslims. So who is Haman and why is he so bad?
Well, Haman, or Haman, as I like to call him, is a villain in the Hebrew Bible's book of Esther. He attempts to annihilate the Jewish people of the ancient Persian Empire. His attempts fail, the Jews are saved, and they instituted an annual festival called Purim to celebrate that success. And for the past 2,000 or so years, Jews have been celebrating this relief from the threat of Haman or Haman. This story appears, of course, in the Hebrew Bible, so it is also a Christian story, but there are reasons why Jews have paid more attention to it than Christians throughout history. And Haman also appears in the Qur'an, so there should be Muslim attention to the character. But I suppose that while we get into our discussion, we'll pick this apart and understand why he's taken on different levels of importance in different religious cultures.
Yeah, and he's just gone to a next level of importance because of this book. So everyone, we have the Professor Adam Silverstein, who's just written, I keep saying Haman. You're very gracious, and I'm sure that's not Hebrew or Arabic or anything. I don't know, Americans say Haman. So this, amazing book with Princeton University Press. I'll give a very brief intro of Adam. It's okay, I'll just call you Adam from here on out. And then we're going to get right into the conversation of like the ultimate bad guy. And the cool thing is that he's not only in the Bible, he's also in the Qur'an, and he's somewhere else in the Qur'an. So we're going to explain that mystery. Why is he in one place in the Bible and another place in the Qur'an? So, friends, this is an amazing book. It's called a biography because it takes you through, Haman and his whole story through culture, through, possible kind of ancient Near East roots, through the Bible and the Quran, but also through the later reception, why he's such a big bad guy to many Jews, also Christians too, if you're more biblically minded, folks who know their Bible, Christians really know him. And then the story of Islam also is covered in the book. Adam also wrote, the standard book, which presents Islamic history. It's in the very short introduction series of Oxford University Press, published in 2010. So it's called Islamic History, a very short introduction. It's actually not that short. It goes into detail, and it's a standard work in the field. Find that as well on Amazon. You'll see like how many ratings and reviews it's had. It's been a big hit. He is professor at the Department of Islam and Middle Eastern Studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Okay, so let's start with Haman. You already mentioned, I think that he's in the biblical book of Esther, so one of a couple of books from the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, generally referred to by the name of a woman. There's a couple of those, Ruth and Judith and Esther. And who's Esther and who's Haman and what's the story about? Can we start there, Adam?
Sure. It's
kind of a standard. Let's start because your book tells us there are different versions of the story. So let's go with the standard Hebrew, Masoretic text version of the story of Esther.
Okay. Well, the book of Esther is basically a cross between a Cinderella story and an Arabian Nights court intrigue. So there are two heroes, a male called Mordecai. He's the representative of the Jewish people of ancient Persia. And he has a cousin, an orphan, whom he adopts by the name of Esther. And they grow up in ancient Persia. Mordecai works at the court of the king Xerxes and manages to foil an assassination attempt against the king. Just put that on the side. We'll come back to it later. In the meantime, another minister at the court by the name of Haman is promoted by King Xerxes to be his second in command, his vizier. And as such, he expects that all the other ministers at court prostrate themselves before him. They all do, except for Mordecai, who says, I cannot prostrate myself before him because I'm a Jew. This infuriates Haman, who expects the adulation of all the other ministers, And he decides that if being a Jew is what prevented Mordecai from prostrating,
This is a problem.
then he has a problem with all Jews, and sets out to annihilate the Jewish people. He gets the king to agree to this. And in the meantime, Esther wins a beauty contest and becomes the Queen of Persia. So these two subplots end up coming together when Mordecai hears that the Jews are under threat, knows that his adopted daughter and cousin is in a position to help. She's the queen, and he asks her to intervene on behalf of the Jewish people. To make a long story short, she does this. Haman had planned to hang Mordecai from a very tall gallows, 50 cubits high, 75 feet, and ends up being hanged from the very same gallows. The Jews are happy about this, take revenge on all of Haman's supporters in the empire, over 70,000 people. And the Jews celebrate this victory, this salvation from communal threat, in a festival called Purim.
Yeah, so that was about as bare bones as you could get, because there's all sorts of details in the story that are intriguing, mysterious, cool, like the story of the beauty contest. I think we have to circle back to that, because I think there's drunken men and a woman who doesn't just easily obey her husband involved with that. But first, to give sort of a historical context, according to the story of Esther, you've told us that there are Jews. The story is taking place in Iran. Few hundred years BCE. I'm not going to guess. I probably should know, but if I guess, I'll get it wrong. But the story never actually tells us why there are Jews in Iran at this period, or does it?
Well, when it introduces Mordecai, it says that he had been one of the exiles who had been exiled from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, which happened in 587 BCE. So he's improbably old. Let's put that on the table. But the basic idea is that Jews had been exiled from the Holy Land to the Persian Empire, to Babylonia. But the Persian Empire then was huge. It spanned from India to Egypt, well, to Ethiopia. So the idea that Jews were in the Iranian Empire does not mean they were in Iran. It means they could have been pretty much anywhere in the Near and Middle East.
But the city is Susa,
right,
which today is in the southern part of Iran, right? The city where the story unfolds.
Yeah, Ahvaz today.
Just to go through a little bit the historical context in which this is taking place, and then we'll zero in on Haman a little bit. The story then makes sense in the kind of grander chronology of the Bible. For those who don't know that chronology, the way things go is that David is kind of great king. Solomon, there's a division between the tribes of Israel after Solomon. So there's tribes in the north, they're taken away by more or less by the Assyrians, in the late 8th century. And then the tribes in the south and Judah, including Jerusalem, are taken away. And that's the real trauma, because even the temple is destroyed, as you said, in 587 BCE, and they're taken off to the east. And that's presumably the reader will, kind of connect everything and know that's why there are Jews in Iran when, they read about the story of Esther and Mordecai. So Mordecai is a good guy. And as we mentioned, Haman's the bad guys. So just briefly to zero in on Haman, what can we know? What would the reader who read the Hebrew Bible version of the book of Esther know about Haman himself? His background, we already know that, he wants people to bow down to him, which is not very cool. But yeah, what can we know about this guy?
Actually, a lot. First of all, he's introduced as an Agagite, Agagi in Hebrew, which presumably has to do with Agag, the Amalekite king, known from the Hebrew Bible, earlier books thereof. And the Amalekites were the perennial enemies of the Israelites and the Jews. So calling him an Agagite basically sets him up as the bad guy before he's even done anything. That's the first thing we know about him. We also know that his father's name was Hamdata, traditional Persian name. We know the names of his wife, Zeresh, his 10 sons, and we don't know the names of the spouses or children of any other characters in the story. In other words, he's the most 3D character in the entire book.
Yeah. Yep.
That's one thing. Another thing to bear in mind about Haman is that he is a bumbling fool. He has lots of plans, he has lots of schemes, but they amount to nothing. And not only do they amount to nothing, but it's almost farcical how his schemes unfold despite his best intentions. So he doesn't like Mordecai because he slighted him, and he goes to his wife, and they're described as his wife and his loved ones, implying a loveless marriage, and says, guys, Haman's bothering me, what should I do? She tells him, build a gallows from which to hang him. And then in the next chapter, she says, by the way, is that Mordecai Jewish? Oh, well, then you stand no chance against him. In other words, the advice he got from those who are supposed to be helping him turns out to have been bad advice. The king asks him how he can...
But sorry, just to jump in. This is again his wife.
Yeah.
So the wife is like, oh, this Mordecai guy who's bothering you, this is how you can vanquish him. And then she turns around and she's like, actually, there's no point.
Later on, when they discover that he's Jewish, they say, well, if he's Jewish, then you're destined to fail. Which, he's thinking, I turn to you for advice, and this is what I get. The king decides to promote Mordecai and says to Haman, how would you recommend that I celebrate somebody whom I greatly respect? Haman thinks it's about him and describes his wildest dreams. And then the king says, great, now go and do that to your arch rival. One thing after another, Haman just seems to be a kind of a tragic villain, somebody who he wants to be bad, but bad things are happening to him along the way. And eventually...
So maybe he's not the ultimate bad guy, right? This is not like Darth Vader who builds the Death Star. Who knows the engineering to build the Death Star.
In the story itself, in the Hebrew Bible, he does not come across as pure evil. He's a much more complex figure. To somebody who doesn't know what to expect, you might even feel empathetic towards him. Towards the end of the story, he goes and begs Esther for forgiveness, for mercy, and he prostrates before her. The thing he wanted people to do to him, he lowers himself before Esther. The king walks in and says, what are you doing to my wife? Misunderstands the situation and has him killed for a crime he didn't commit, like the A-team. So Haman is just this poor guy who
was basically assaulting his wife.
Yeah, and he was basically doing the opposite, trying to beg forgiveness or mercy. So lots of things happen to Haman that are unfortunate for him. So he is a villain, and throughout history he takes on this role as the bogeyman, the bad guy, the pantomime villain. But in the story itself, a subtle reading of it displays somebody who's a little bit more complex, a little bit like Esau and Ishmael in the Hebrew Bible, who aren't terrible. I mean, they are in many ways victims. Esau is the victim of a plot. He was supposed to have the birthright, and a few hundred years later,
the plot of his own mother, right? Of Rebecca?
Yeah. So there are all sorts of biblical stories that accrue layers of exegetical materials that transform the way we remember these stories. So now wake up any Jewish child in the world and say, what do you think of Haman? He won't say, he's a complex character who is a tragic villain. He'll say, he's terrible, he's the embodiment of evil and threats and anti-Semitism or whatever. But that's not entirely faithful to the text itself.
So we'll hopefully be able to circle back to the afterlife of Haman, and but I did want to just kind of clarify or maybe emphasize that there's reason to believe from the text itself that he's not a Iranian Persian. You mentioned that he's described as an Agagite, and then you mentioned the Amalekites. So I just want to, for those who don't know maybe the biblical story, the Amalekites are opponents of the people of Israel as they leave Egypt on their way to the Promised Land. There's battles against them, and then there's more trouble later when the Israelites are settled in the Promised Land. And then there's one particular story in which Saul, the king who comes before David, gets into trouble because he doesn't kill the king of the Amalekites, hopefully I'm getting this right, whom they've taken captive. And that guy's name, the king of the Amalekites, is Agag. So that's an Agagite connection.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And I think Agag was the name of the Amalekite kings. So there's another Agag in, I think, Deuteronomy, in Numbers. So it's sort of like saying the Pharaoh for an Egyptian ruler.
Yes. Yes.
But yeah, so Haman is an Amalekite if he's an Agagite, but his father's name and his children's names are all Persian.
Are
So
Persian.
there's a lot
So the
of
name, like the reference to Agag or the Agagite, would signal to a Jewish reader that this is like the typical opponent to Israel or to the Jews.
yeah, exactly. So he's set up as a bad guy before he does anything. But then he does things that objectively make him threatening and persecutor. And that's the memory that's taken from the story for generations of Jews, that Haman is the one who tries to kill us.
So we've been speaking basically about the version of the Esther story where Haman is the kind of nemesis of the heroes. So the version of that story that's found in the Hebrew Bible and in got Catholic Bibles, not surprisingly, in front of me. I was going to grab a Protestant Bible, and in for the most part Protestant Old Testaments. So the story is much more complicated, and you help the reader navigate what happens in the development of the Esther tradition. So in fact, we have later versions of the Esther story written down in Greek, not in Hebrew. And it's actually more complicated than maybe we should get into, but to focus on the Greek version that is found in the standard translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, done at the end of the last centuries BCE. So what's known as a Septuagint. So in that Greek version of Esther, there's changes, there's some stuff missing, but there's also significant stuff added, including, I guess, the role of God. I mean, is that the biggest change? Is that God now kind of appears in the Esther story?
Yeah, I think the things get lost in translation. So in this case, things are gained in translation. Not only does the Hebrew Bible version of Esther not make any reference to God, I think it's the only book of the Hebrew Bible that doesn't mention God at all, but there's no reference to religion, theology, prayer, sacrifices, temple, nothing. Had it not been in the Hebrew Bible, you could have found it on the bookshelf of political history of ancient Iran. And the book itself at the end says, the contents of this story may be found in the chronicles of Media and Persia. So it behaves as though it's a secular book of political history and not a religious book. Readers of the story realize that it's important, realize that it has significance, but also realize that it's not a perfect fit with the rest of the Bible, and sought to correct it, to rewrite it, or to include aspects of the story details that might make it a better fit with the rest of the biblical library. So we do get references to God in the story itself, but we also get 6 additions, 6 passages that are entirely unrelated to what you find in the Masoretic text in the Hebrew Bible. So you get the prayer of Esther, you get in Mordecai, you have a dream and interpretation, you have letters written between the king and the provinces, entire passages, and they change the meaning of the story. What's most relevant to us is that they change Haman's character, because he's not an Agagite anymore. He's described as a Bugayan. We don't really know what that means. Probably something like a braggart, somebody with
nothing good, nothing good,
and a Macedonian. And this is the interesting bit. One of the additions, one of the passages that are added on, explains that he was actually a hostile foreign agent of the Macedonians sent to overthrow the Persian Empire. So now he's not only an enemy of Mordecai, an enemy of the Jews of the empire, but he's also a threat to the empire itself and the Persian king, which makes him a little bit more universally hated and not just a nemesis of a particular minority group within the empire.
Okay, and then the question of God, and I mean, it's pretty remarkable to hear that in the Hebrew Bible, this is the one text that doesn't refer to God. Is that the principal reason why there was some hesitation among certain Jews and certain Christians even to include Esther in the Bible?
Yeah. Basically, early Jews clearly had question marks about this story. There was more than one ancient Hebrew version of it, so clearly this was not something that was set in stone early on. People were playing around with it as though it's not a canonical text that cannot be altered.
They have felt at liberty to, yeah.
It was more of a story than a holy book, at least to begin with. And early important Jewish communities like the Dead Sea Scrolls community of Qumran did not include it in their library, did not include Purim in their
calendar. They knew about it. The folks around the Dead Sea Scrolls, they knew about it. They knew about it and chose not to.
Yeah, from their language, it's clear that they are borrowing or influenced by language in Esther. And we know their ritual calendar, and it doesn't include Purim where it should be included. So they very consciously decided this is not in our Bible. So there were even early Jews who were not happy with Esther as a biblical book. But the contents of the story, at least in the Hebrew Bible version of it, don't sit well with the messages, or some of the messages of the New Testament. So, I mean, there's a lot of vengeance against your enemy in the book of Esther after Haman,
including by the Jews of Susa, right? Or of the whole empire.
Once Haman is dead, you would have thought, okay, the threat is passed. Esther insists on his children being hanged, 10 sons, and then 70,000 other Iranians, Persians are killed as well. This is something that doesn't, as I said, it doesn't sit well with the idea that if someone slaps your right cheek, you should show him your left cheek, or love your enemy. Things that we hear in the Sermon on the Mount, for instance. This is not very Christian. So if you're a Christian reader of the Bible and you come across this story, you might wonder what message you're supposed to take from it. It's about Jews. It's about a threat against Jews that never came to pass. And it betrays an attachment to ethnicity and to violence and vengeance, that all of these things go against what we're trying to understand about religion in the early centuries of Christianity. So there were a number of reasons why this book needed to be corrected. So in the Septuagint, it was rewritten
much more than just the absence of God. But then, I mean, sorry to fast forward, but we want to get to the Qur'an as well. And Haman or Haman in the Qur'an. I mean, when you get to the Reformation, am I right? Luther hesitates about this, right?
Oh yeah, he doesn't. I mean, look, he knows it's in the Bible, and there's nothing he can do about that. But he does say he wishes it wasn't. He says that in the book of, I think, 2 Maccabees. He says he wishes they just weren't in the Bible. They're books full of vengeance, and they display the worst characteristics of the Jews, bloodthirsty, vengeance, and all these things that he doesn't like. But eventually, Protestants used the narrative framework against Catholics. For instance, in the conspiracy against the British King and Parliament in 1605, the Guy Fawkes attempt to overthrow Protestant king in England, and Guy Fawkes was killed and hanged. And every year on November 5th, there's Guy Fawkes Night, and they
burn something or other, yeah,
ceremony. And in sermons for hundreds of years, sermons on Guy Fawkes Night, they would relate that story to the Esther story. And part of this, I think, is related to the fact that in late antiquity, many Jews were living under Roman rule, Byzantine rule, the Christian Roman Empire. And the idea developed that Haman was actually a Roman. So we have this ready-made package of midrashic materials that describe Haman as a Roman. And then we have Protestants 1,000 or so years later seeing the Pope as the big enemy, and using Catholic ready-made kind of package of motifs for polemical purposes. So it's true that initially there was hesitation about including Esther within the Christian canon, but eventually even Protestants who used the unevolved pre-God version of Esther found ways to make use of the story for their purposes.
I love that description. Yeah, so actually today, if you look at a Catholic Bible like this one, I mean, it's complicated. They try to mark what is the original Hebrew text, but then they include the Greek editions. And there's still more work that has to be done. So it's very complicated for a translator or an editor. But we also want to speak about this text, about the Quran. And, in your book, when telling the story of Haman, you don't stop with the Bible and its reception, but you note that there's a character who in Arabic, in the Quran appears, and in Arabic his name is Haman. And, we already alluded to this at the beginning. He doesn't appear in Persia or Iran. He appears in Egypt. And maybe you could just introduce the problem of Haman in the Quran. Is this even the same Haman that we find in the Bible?
Okay, so first of all, I've been calling him Haman until now, not because I'm trying to be contrary, but because in the Hebrew Bible he's called Haman. And calling him Haman in English and Haman in the Quran makes it sound as though they're similar yet different, but the Quranic Haman is vowel for vowel.
Linguistically, it matches the Hebrew and the Arabic.
Absolutely. So we have exactly the same name, but and he is a villain. He's a nemesis of the believers, the Israelite believers. But as you say, he is not in ancient Persia. He's in pharaonic Egypt with Pharaoh and in the period of Moses. So there are a lot of similarities, but there are also differences. A major difference is that Pharaoh commissions this Haman to build him a tower, Sarh, that spans between the earth and the heavens, which to biblically literate listeners straight away signals a whole different context in the Bible, the Tower of Babel. And we're told that Haman in the Quran has junud, he has armies, and Haman and Pharaoh are joined at least twice by Qarun, which is Korah. So there are
biblical character from the Exodus period, right?
Correct. And okay. He's a rival of Moses, but he's an Israelite. So Haman is a rival of Moses in the Quran, Korah is a rival of Moses in the Bible. But there are threads that link these characters, but there are also things that clearly distinguish between them. And historically, Muslim readers of the Bible, and there were many in the Middle Ages, had no problem with this. The boundaries between religions, Judaism's, Christianity's, Islam's, Samaritans, they were much more porous than they are nowadays. Now everyone sticks to their book or no book, whatever interests them, aside from people who explore the Quran and the Bible. And at the time, there was a much more open discussion. People would learn from each other. It says in the Quran, if you have a doubt about these things, ask those who received the book before you. So that's what people would do. There's an elusive reference to somebody by the name of Haman 6 times in the Quran. Jews are seen once a year celebrating his demise in a very public ceremony, and they would learn from each other. So Muslims very early on knew that Haman was a biblical character as well. There's no problem with this from Muslim theological perspectives, because the Quran is the Bible unadulterated. But there are differences, and these differences were smoothed over in many ways. So for instance, Haman's backstory in medieval Israeliyat, kind of Islamic midrashic stories about Quranic figures, described Haman as arriving in Egypt from Iran. He was in Iran, he grew up there, and then he moved to Egypt with Pharaoh and got a job there. So no problem with that.
So it's a way of, harmonizing the Haman of the Bible who's in Iran and the Haman of the Quran who's in Egypt. It's just phase 1 and phase 2 of his life.
Exactly. And some pretty impressive scholars, Al-Biruni, one of my heroes, he knows about this story. He knows about the biblical and the Quranic Haman, and doesn't seem to bother him that much. But from the 9th century, if not earlier, I know the 9th century because Jahid, the great literature provocateur of Abbasid letters, described Christians poking fun at Muslim theology by saying, you guys think that Haman was in Egypt, whereas he was really in ancient Iran. So already in the 9th century, we hear echoes of this kind of polemical use of Haman by Christians against the Quran.
And which shows that the Quran is all wrong, Islam is false, Christianity is right. I mean, that would
doesn't have to be all wrong.
The hoped for conclusion.
Look, the Bible, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament or both, contain descriptions of miracles. The Quran from Muslim theology is the miracle. So it's not it doesn't have to all be wrong. All you need is one error, and the house of cards will collapse. So Christian polemicists, anti-Muslim polemicists, were looking for an error, and Haman was a glaring example of something that doesn't add up if you're beginning from a biblical point of view. So from Al-Jahaz's allusion to Christian polemicists to 15th, 16th, 17th century Christians who would write anti-Muslim tracts, they would say, look, Mahund, whatever they call the prophet, mixed up his sacred stories. He puts Haman, who everyone knows is an ancient Persian character, in Egypt with Pharaoh and Moses. And therefore, we know that the Quran is not from God because God doesn't make mistakes. So the fact that this was used in such a direct challenge to Islamic theology and to the very heart of Islamic theology, Ijaz al-Qur'an, this is something that needed a response.
Yeah, Ijaz being the inimitability or the perfection of the Quran.
Yeah. So yeah, the Quran is perfect. Jews and Christians could look at various manuscripts of the Bible and look at different sort of readings and manuscript traditions, but the Quran is on a different level within Islam than the Torah or the New Testament are within Jews.
But I have this sense, we don't have to get into the weeds of Islamic history for those who want to not get into the weeds, but the flowers of Islamic history. They should read Adam's book, Islamic History, a very short introduction. So, I mean, there's that polemical dimension, but then you also note in the book, you've already mentioned al-Biruni, you speak about Ibn Khaldun as well, great Muslim historians who in a more kind of scientific, sober way, describe as they understand it, who Haman was historically and all of this. But, I mean, you alluded to in, let's say, I don't know, the internet world of 2025, where folks are fighting, or they're actually going to resolve on the internet who has a true religion once and for all. So while they're up to that, this sort of claim by Christians, usually Christians, although presumably it could be from Jews as well, that the Quran is all wrong because of the one mistake, as you said, of putting Haman in Egypt. Yeah, you said it begs a response. So how do Muslims respond to that?
So I can't represent all Muslim responses, but the one that stood out for me because it's so ironic. It almost kind of mirrors Haman's career as a topsy-turvy reversal theme. Not only is Haman's existence in Egypt in the Quran a proof that the Quran is wrong, but it is a proof that the Quran is right and from God. And the champion of this answer was none other than Maurice Bucaille, famous author of the Bible, the Quran, and Science, a French physician to Middle Eastern rulers, King Faisal and others, who was an amateur, well-published Egyptologist who discovered two miracles in the Quran, which, according to some authorities, led to his conversion to Islam. Others say he stopped at saying the Quran is a miracle, but either way, this is the fact that Haman occurs in pharaonic Egypt, to him was something that strengthened the Quran's claim to divine providence. And the argument goes as follows. Haman in the Quran is commissioned with building a tower between the heavens and the earth, something that does not turn up at all in the Bible. So you would have thought that this is just some sort of mix-up between the Tower of Babel and ancient Persia and so on and so forth. But in 1822, hieroglyphs were deciphered and dictionaries were produced that explain this new hieroglyphic language. And lo and behold, he discovered that in ancient Egypt, there was a functionary by the name of Haman who was in charge of Pharaoh's mega building projects. And he says, hang on a minute, how could an illiterate nomad in 7th century Arabia have known something that was lost to us when the hieroglyphs were undecipherable? Clearly, this must have come from God. And that, together with the fact that Pharaoh's body was preserved as a sign for future generations, those two details, historical details that were confirmed by the Quran, convinced him that the Quran is actually of divine origin. So rather than using Haman to disprove the Quran, he used Haman to prove it.
So there, yeah. So there's the Maurice Bucaille, which we probably don't have to spend time in refuting, his reading of the hieroglyph and whatever pharaoh, which one of them was up to, and building stuff up to the heavens. Just would kind of register that as kind of one apologetic response by Muslims. And then, there's another response you allude to in the book, which is just to say, yeah, Haman was in Persia, fine. And then there's another Haman earlier, centuries earlier, presumably, who is in Moses's Egypt with the Pharaoh. Why can't there? I mean, we have Michael Jordan and Michael Jackson. They're both Michaels, but it's not the same person. What's the big deal there? Well, the big deal is that you show in the book how the stories actually are connected. Now, it's a little bit complicated, and it has to do, I think, maybe the place to start, but maybe actually a better way to start, with a story that is neither the Quran nor the Bible, which is a wisdom story presented in different languages around a figure named Ahikar. So if I've got that right, I mean, who's Ahikar, and how does he connect the Haman or the Haman of the Bible and the Quran?
Okay, so Ahikar nowadays is not very well known, but he was a household name for a couple of millennia. From about the 5th century BC to well into the Middle Ages, his story, the tales of Ahikar the sage, the wise Luqman, he appears as Luqman in the Qur'an. This guy was a household name for educated people in the Near and Middle East, even in Europe. Aesop's fables are based on some of Ahikar's sayings. So this is a very, very common story about an ancient wise man who had no children. He had served as the Assyrian vizier for decades, but before he died, he wanted to have a successor, and he had a nephew by the name of Nadan or Nadab, who was actually treacherous. And his nephew decided to spread a rumor that his uncle had died, I guess to take his place. I don't know why he did this. And the Pharaoh of Egypt heard that the wise man of the Assyrians is dead, and therefore he can challenge them to a brain teaser for
because there's nobody smart enough now in Assyria that who could possibly solve this. Okay.
Exactly, the riddle. So in exchange for 3 years of tax revenues, he challenged the Assyrian king to send someone to build a tower between the heavens and the earth, thinking that Ahikar was dead and they wouldn't find anyone. In the meantime,
just to recall, I'm sorry, I'm being terrible in jumping in, but just to make sure that everyone's following along and connecting the dots, the nature of the challenge, building a tower from heaven to earth, obviously interests us in understanding why the Quran has, or at least in connecting things to the Quran, which has Pharaoh tell Haman to build a tower from heaven to earth.
Right. So Pharaoh
challenges.
Exactly. So Pharaoh challenges someone in the east to build him a tower between the heavens and the earth, thinking that they won't manage. In the meantime, Ahikar, who had been imprisoned, hidden away, emerges and manages to do it. What's interesting about the story from our perspective is that in a later reference to it, in something called the Book of Tobit, about 200 BC, a Jewish ancient Hellenistic book that didn't make it into many Bibles, there's reference to the story which says something like, remember how Achikar's nephew was treacherous to him, and the name of the nephew there is not Nadav, it is Haman. In other words, there's a kind of typo, an ancient typo or penno, I don't know what you would call it, a feathero, where instead of writing the actual name, they wrote Haman as the nephew who was supposedly going to be commissioned to build a tower for Pharaoh between heavens and earth. And even though that's a mistake, the fact that people were making this mistake tells us that it may well have been remembered that way in certain circles in the Near East, that there was a challenge by Pharaoh to someone called Haman to build a tower between the heavens and the earth. Do I think that this solves all our problems? Not necessarily. Actually, definitely not. But it's certainly a link in a chain that comprises a few other links, such as the fact that pharaoh or the pharaohs in Islamic literature were known to be Amalekites. So we're told from the very earliest tafsir sources that Fir'aun was the laqab, the permanent title of the Amalekite kings. So if Haman is an Amalekite and Fir'aun, the pharaohs are, the Fara'ina are Amalekites, then we have another link in the chain, not a smoking gun, smoke. We have the Aikar connection, we have this, we have the fact that of this kind of paradigmatic villainy against the believing group of Israelites. There are a lot of things here, a lot of breadcrumbs that lead us to connect the two Hamans. And as I said, for the first few centuries of Islamic history, anyone who is aware of the Jewish and Christian lore about the biblical Haman and the Quranic Haman had no problem mixing these things together. He was clearly one and the same guy. We just had to explain how before he reached the Bible, or before he reached the Quran, he had been in Iran, or before he reached the Bible, he had been in Egypt. But the problem was not a problem until people made it a problem. And that's the interfaith polemical polemical use.
So often the case. Like there's a chill way to just see these things and not make them into a problem. But on the Aikar stuff, I want to just underline two things. Maybe you have a comment, or we go on. I have at least one more question for you, but just to underline two things. So Aikar is a well-known wisdom figure, and his the stories about Aikar were spread widely, and there's a clear connection with the wisdom figure in the Qur'an who has a surah or a chapter of the Qur'an named after him, Luqman. So some of the sayings given to Luqman in the Qur'an are very close to sayings attributed to Aikar. So that's actually important to me, at least as I'm kind of processing your analysis of this whole business. So Aikar was known in the context of the Qur'an's composition. And then the other thing is that in the stories of Aikar, which obviously are well before the Qur'an, there is the specific detail of building, Pharaoh commanding someone to build a tower to heaven. So, that's pretty good, right? That actually, to me, is very compelling, but it's only, I guess, gets us halfway there because it doesn't necessarily show the connection to the name Haman. It just shows us that Aikar, maybe has two roles in the Quran, at least, probably others we haven't found yet. One with Luqman and one with the story of the tower. And then the other point, I'm sorry, probably this is needless going through it, but just to make sure I've got it and viewers follow, is that you have this later book, Tobit, which is in the Catholic Bible, but not in most Protestant Bibles, which in some versions has a reference to, instead of in the Hebrew text. No, I got in this totally wrong. Instead of in the story of Aikar, the nephew is Nadab or something else. In the story of Aikar, in the book of Tobit, there's a reference to that story, and the name appears as Haman. So I kind of get that right. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's it. I'll just add one more wrinkle to this.
Yeah,
and that is that it's clear to modern scholars, to ancient exegetes, Jewish, Christian, and other, that the Esther story, as it appears in the Hebrew Bible, was conditioned or shaped literarily by the Joseph story. There are many references and many turns of phrase that only occur in Esther and in the Joseph story, and that puts an Egyptian kind of shine on the Esther story a little bit. And if you're looking for another link in the chain, you can see the fluidity between ancient Persian forts and ancient Egyptian forts, even in the original Hebrew version of Esther. So there are a lot of reasons to see these two Hamans as being related, if not identical. But the only thing I would point out on this topic, the final point, is that for many readers of the Esther story, either modern scholars or Christians who would read the story allegorically or typologically, the story is not literal history. It is a literary story which is imparting important messages to us theological messages, life advice, but we're not to take the details in it at historic face value. And once we accept this as a possibility, then a Muslim looking at the Qur'an, the Quranic Haman, will say, I realize that Haman in the Bible is different from Haman in the Qur'an, but I'm not going to take history lessons from the biblical Esther book. That's not a history book. That's a historical novella, or some sort of, like The Crown, or what was the other show you were referring to earlier? Some sort of historical drama.
Yes.
But not a historical reference work. So sure, they took aspects of the Joseph story from Egypt. They took an Egyptian character by the name of Haman from Egypt and put him in this story, imparted some very important messages. That's great. But don't tell me that there's a mistake in the Quran on the basis of a historical novella.
Yeah, so that could be one Muslim apologetical response, and another, and of course, anyone can do whatever they want, but another could also be to read the Haman passages in the Quran, also typologically or allegorically, and not as what really happened as well. So if I can ask a more sort of personal question about your experience with Haman, looking back, probably spent you and Haman spent a couple of years together, probably. So what's your relationship with Haman? What do you think of this guy?
Look, I on and off spent about 20 years of my life thinking about him with this book in mind. So if you want to know what 20 years looks like between two covers, that's what it is. And the good news, let's start with the bad news. The bad news is I started off thinking he was a bad guy, and after 20 years, I've come to the conclusion that he's a bad guy. So I haven't actually changed my view. The good news is that it's a fairly detailed book. I hope it's written accessibly. But what we're learning about Haman in this book is not just about him and his character, but I think, at least for me, what's more interesting is about how people who took this character seriously for being in Scripture, how they applied him to their own lives. And I think that even for topics in exploring the Quran and the Bible that have nothing to do with Esther and Haman, there are things that we can learn from this story that will kind of cast light on other corners of the relationship between the Bible and the Quran. The one that came to mind the other day was when you were discussing Iblis, Satan, Satan's fall the fall from heaven, Iblis 7 times in the Quran. That was one of your more recent episodes. And that story is about God commanding the entire kind of group of ministers to prostrate before one of them, and they all, Adam, and they all agree except for one, who's the rebel. And that theme, that motif, is exactly what we hear in the book of Esther, where the king requires everyone to prostrate before the vizier Haman. Everyone agrees except for one, each one for their own arguments, and this starts the whole drama of the story. Satan, Shaitan, is referred to as a marid in the Quran, and Mordecai's name is from the same root. There's a lot of stuff.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot of stuff going on here that could be relevant. In another episode, you were talking about the Najashi and Ethiopia, and I straight away went to Abraha, the bad accent, like this whole complex of heroes and villains. And one of the things that you and Hassan were discussing was, is this a historical story or not? And it's not that I don't care. I don't think that's the main point. I think from looking at heroes and villains, we can learn so much about the people who are threatened by them, whether it's Jews or Protestants under Catholic rule, or Shiites under Sunnis. People using Haman polemically are telling us something about their innermost fears, about what bothers them, what worries them. And I think, as a historian of Middle Eastern history, I think that's the real story here. So Haman has helped me learn so much about things that aren't really directly related to the Book of Esther or the Quran, more about the history of Abrahamic communities in the Near and Middle East for the past 2.5 millennia. So I think if you read the book, sure, you'll learn about Haman. Of course, you'll learn about the Bible and the Quran, but you'll also get this kind of potted history of religious communities interacting from the beginning until the 21st century.
Thank you so much, Adam. Friends, you'll find links to to the big book we're talking about, the key book, Haman, a Biography from Princeton University Press. So the link will be in the description. There'll also be links to other works of Professor Silverstein. And I'd encourage you to check all of those out. You won't regret it. Thanks also to you for being here, even at the end of the episode. Friends, community of exploring the Quran and the Bible. Don't hesitate, of course, to subscribe or even to join and be part of the inner circle. So Adam, thank you so much.
Thank you. Ya'tik al-afiyah, as they say.
Allah yafiq. Thank you. And friends, thank you for being here, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Take care.